With respect, Mr. Gaines, nobody in this room doubts that you love that old farm. But you're 80 years old. The paperwork's behind, the fields have gone to seed, and let's be honest with each other, you just can't manage it anymore. This development will bring 400 jobs to this county. Let us take it off your hands at a fair price before you lose it for nothing. He said it into the microphone at the front of a packed county commission room. And then he turned and smiled out at the crowd. A slick young man in a suit that cost more than the old farmer's truck. And he said it as though he were performing a kindness. And Ezekiel Gaines, 80 years old, in his one good church suit with his hat in his hands, sat in the second row of that hearing room with a worn shoebox resting on his knees. And he did not say a word. He just listened, patient as a field waiting on rain, while a stranger, half his age, explained to a whole room of people that the land his family had held for 150 years was about to slip right through his tired old fingers. Have you ever had someone a third of your age look at your gray hair and your slow hands and decide, out loud, that they knew better than you what to do with the very thing you had spent your entire life protecting? Have you ever been told in so many words that you had gotten too old to hold on to what was yours? In 20 minutes, that smiling young developer was going to learn that the foolish old farmer he was being so gracious to had seen his whole scheme coming from a mile off years ago, and had spent 4 quiet decades building a wall around that land so high and so deep that no man in an expensive suit was ever going to climb over it. And when Ezekiel Gaines finally stood up and finally opened that shoebox, the whole room was going to go so quiet you could hear the clock on the wall. Stay with me. You are going to want to be in that room when the old man opens the box. His name was Ezekiel Gaines. Everybody called him Zeke. He was 80 years old, and to understand why he sat so calm and so still while a stranger tried to take his life out from under him, you have to understand the dirt. Because to Zeke Gaines, it was never just land. Let me take you back, all the way back, further than most stories go. The Gaines land sat on 240 acres of good bottom soil out past the county road. And the Gaines family had held every one of those acres since 1868. That is not a number Zeke Gaines ever said casually. 1868, 3 years after the end of slavery. Because it was in 1868 that a man named Isaac Gaines, Zeke's great-great-grandfather, a man who had been born the property of another man and freed as a grown adult with nothing but the clothes on his back and the calluses on his hands, managed to do the almost impossible thing. He bought land. He worked and he scraped and he saved and he bought 240 acres of his own, in a time and a place that did everything in its considerable power to make sure a freed black man would never own a single square foot of anything. Isaac Gaines put his own name on a deed to American soil at a time when his name had, a few years before, appeared only on an inventory of somebody's property, listed between a mule and a set of plow blades, with a dollar value beside it. Think about that for a moment, because Zeke thought about it every day of his life. There was a piece of paper once that had Isaac's name on it and called him a thing worth a certain number of dollars. And Isaac Gaines had lived long enough and worked hard enough and been stubborn enough to make sure there was a second piece of paper, a deed that had his name on it and called him an owner. He turned himself, with nothing but his own 2 hands and a refusal to quit, from a name on an inventory into a name on a title, and that right there is the whole story of the Gaines family in one sentence. And he swore, the family story goes, standing in that field with the deed folded in his shirt pocket over his heart, that this land would belong to his people for as long as the world turned, that no one would ever again tell a Gaines where he could and could not stand. Remember Isaac, remember 1868. Everything Zeke did, he did for a promise made in a field by a man he never met. For 150 years, through everything this country threw at a black family trying to hold land, the Gaineses held on. They held on through the decades, when white neighbors and county clerks and taxmen used every trick in a very thick book to peel black-owned farmland away, acre by acre, all across the South. Zeke had watched it happen his whole life. He had watched it happen to the Pruitts down the road, and the Coleman place, and the old Ferguson farm. He had watched how it was done, the quiet, legal, patient theft of it. A tax bill that never quite got delivered. An heir nobody could find. A piece of paper signed by a man who could not read what he was signing. He watched families who had farmed for generations get walked off their own land by men in suits holding documents. He had watched it up close with the Pruitts, who lived just down the road, good people, 4 generations on their place. Old man Pruitt died without a clear will, and the land passed, the way it so often did, to a scattered crowd of heirs, children and grandchildren and cousins in 3 states, none of them holding clear title, each of them owning only a sliver. And that, Zeke knew, was the crack the suited men were always looking for. Because the law let them find one single distant heir, buy that one person's tiny share for a little money, and then, as a part owner, force the whole property to be sold at auction over the objections of every family member still living on it. That is exactly what happened to the Pruitts. A company found a great-grandson in another state who had never set foot on the farm, bought his fraction and forced a sale. And the family that had worked that ground for 100 years stood in their own yard and watched it auctioned out from under them for a fraction of its worth, legally, quietly, with a smile and a handshake. Zeke never forgot the look on Sarah Pruitt's face that day, and he learned young that for a black farmer, loving your land was not enough. You had to understand it. You had to understand the law better than the men who used the law against you, because they were counting, every single time, on you not understanding it. So Zeke Gaines, who never finished high school, who worked that land with his hands from the time he was 6 years old, became, quietly, one of the most careful students of property law that county ever produced. Nobody knew it. He did not advertise it. To the world, he was just old Zeke out on the Gaines place, a simple country farmer in overalls and a straw hat, slow-talking, slow-walking, the kind of man a slick developer would look at and see an easy afternoon's work. That was exactly what Zeke wanted the world to see. His grandmother had taught him that too. Let them think you're simple, baby. A man underestimates you. He shows you his whole hand. Zeke married a woman named Willa, and Willa Gaines was the love of 60 years of his life. And the two of them raised their children on that land and buried Zeke's parents on that land, because there was a cemetery on the Gaines place, up on the rise under the big oak, and it was the most important 2 acres of the whole 240. Willa used to walk up there with him on Sunday evenings, the 2 of them, and she would pull the weeds from around the older stones with her own hands, the ones so worn you could not read them anymore, and she would say, "Somebody has to remember them. Zeke, if we don't, nobody will, and the world already tried once to make sure nobody would." She tended those graves like a garden for 50 years. And when Willa herself passed, 3 years before this story, Zeke buried her up there too, under the oak next to his mother, and he walked up that rise every single morning after, in every weather, to say good morning to his wife, the way he had said it to her face for 60 years. So when Garrett Voss talked about bulldozers, he was not talking about dirt to Ezekiel Gaines. He was talking about Willa, because in that little burying ground, marked with field stones and iron crosses and a few worn markers, lay the Gaineses, all the way back. Isaac was up there, and below Isaac, in graves with no names at all, only stones, lay the ones who came before, the ones who had been buried on this ground when they were still called property, when a person could be laid in the earth without even a name allowed on the marker. That rise under the oak was, quite literally, where Zeke Gaines's people were, all of them, 150 years and more of them, in the ground he woke up on every morning. That is what Garrett Voss came to buy for pennies and pave into a parking lot. Garrett Voss was 45 years old, and he was a developer, and he was good at it. And the thing he was best at was exactly the thing Zeke had spent his life watching. Voss and his company had spent 3 years quietly buying up the farmland all around the Gaines place. And they had gotten most of it cheap, using the old playbook. The tax angle and the heirs angle, catching families whose land was split among a dozen cousins with no clear title. Forcing sales, picking the county clean. And now they had almost everything they needed for an enormous development, a distribution center and warehouses, and the highway access to serve them. Almost everything. Right in the middle of it, 240 acres, sat the Gaines land, and old Zeke Gaines would not sell. Voss had offered. Zeke had said no. Voss had offered more, a number that would have looked like a fortune to a simple old farmer. Zeke had said no, and Voss, who could not understand a no that money did not move, had decided that the old man must be confused, must not understand the offer, must be too far gone to know what was good for him. So Voss had done the modern version of the old theft. He had gone to the county. He had gotten friendly with a commissioner or two, and he had brought a proposal to condemn the Gaines land, to take it by eminent domain for the public good of 400 jobs. Arguing that the old man was behind on his obligations and could not properly maintain the property anyway. And he had come to this public hearing fully expecting to smile his way through a formality and walk out with 150 years of somebody else's history in his pocket. And here is the moment I think about the most. Not the shoebox. The shoebox is coming. This one first. Because the night before that hearing, Ezekiel Gaines did not sit up studying his documents because he did not need to. He had known those documents by heart for 40 years. Instead, Zeke Gaines walked up the rise in the dark to the burying ground under the big oak, the way he had walked up there 10,000 times in his long life, and he stood among his people. Willa was up there now too, 3 years gone. And Zeke stood in the cool dark among the field stones and the nameless markers. An 80-year-old man with the weight of 150 years on his shoulders. And for a little while, where no one could see him, he let himself be afraid, because that is the truth of it. He was not sure he could win. These men had money and lawyers and a commissioner in their pocket, and he was one old man with a shoebox. And he stood over the graves of the ones who came before, the ones with no names, and he said out loud, in the dark, I'm sorry. I'm trying. They're coming for you again. And I am old, and I am tired, and I am trying to hold on. He put his hand on Willa's stone, and he said, help me hold on. And then he wiped his face, and he went back down the hill, and he slept. Because a man who has done his work 40 years in advance can afford to sleep the night before the storm. He had been afraid, but he had been ready for so much longer than he had been afraid. The hearing room was full the next day. It was full because word had gotten around, the way it does in a county like that, and a great many people had come, black and white, old farmers and young families, because whatever else they thought, a lot of them did not like watching a company from somewhere else pick their county apart, farm by farm. And old Zeke Gaines was the last one standing in the gap. His grandson Micah was there, 14 years old, sitting next to his grandfather, not fully understanding but understanding enough to be scared. Garrett Voss presented first, and he was smooth, and he was kind in the particular way that is the cruelest way, and he stood up there, and he painted his picture. A struggling old man. Fields gone to seed. Paperwork behind. A property that would serve the county so much better as 400 jobs than as one stubborn old farmer's memory. And he turned to Zeke with a soft, pitying smile, and he said into the microphone, for the whole room, we're not the villains here, Mr. Gaines. We're trying to help you avoid a much worse outcome. Nobody wants to see you lose everything. And then the chairman of the commission said, Mr. Gaines, would you like to respond? And Ezekiel Gaines, 80 years old, stood up slowly with his shoebox and walked to the front of that room and set the box down on the table and adjusted the microphone down to his height, and finally he spoke. My family, he said, his voice slow and steady and country and not one bit confused, has owned that land since 1868. My great-great-grandfather Isaac bought it 3 years out of slavery. I have farmed it for 74 years, since I was 6 years old. And this young man is right about one thing. I'm old, he let that sit. But he has made the same mistake about me that a whole lot of men have made in my 80 years. And I have to tell you, it never once worked out the way they planned. And then Zeke Gaines opened the shoebox. I'd like to enter some documents into the record, he said. And he began to lay them out on the table one at a time, in his slow, deliberate farmer's hands. And with each one, the room got quieter, and Garrett Voss's face got stiller. The first thing he laid down was the deed, the original 1868 deed, and behind it, every deed since, an unbroken chain of clear title, 150 years of it, every transfer, every generation, clean and documented and airtight. Because Zeke had spent his life making sure that the one thing they used to steal black land, unclear title, split among lost heirs, could never touch the Gaines place. He had bought out or bought clear every cousin's claim decades ago. There was exactly one owner of that land, and his name was Ezekiel Gaines, and he could prove it back to a man who had been born a slave. The second thing he laid down was a stack of receipts. Every property tax payment, going back 60 years, paid in full, paid early, every single receipt kept. So much for behind on his obligations. Zeke Gaines had not been one day late on a tax bill in his entire adult life because he had watched what a single late tax bill had done to the Pruitts. And then Zeke Gaines laid down the 2 documents that turned the whole room to stone. The first was a certificate. Years before, quietly, Zeke had done something. He had gotten the burying ground on the rise, the 2 acres under the big oak, officially surveyed, documented and registered with the state as a protected historic cemetery. He had brought in a historian. He had proven the graves, the ones with names and the older ones without, going back to the era of slavery. And a registered historic cemetery, under the law of that state, cannot be moved, cannot be developed, cannot be disturbed, not for 400 jobs, not for 4,000. Zeke had made his ancestors' graves into a legal wall that no development could ever cross. And the second document, the last one, the one he laid down so gently, was a conservation easement. 30 years before, when Voss was a boy, Zeke Gaines had placed the entire 240 acres into a permanent agricultural conservation trust. He had signed away forever the right to ever develop that land, and so had every owner who would ever come after him in exchange for one thing: the guarantee in perpetuity, enforceable by law, that the Gaines land would remain farmland and family land and could never, ever be paved, subdivided, condemned for development, or taken for any purpose but the working of the soil forever. People had thought he was crazy at the time, giving up the development rights on 240 acres, walking away from the biggest payday a man like him would ever be offered. His own children had not fully understood it, but Zeke had done the arithmetic that mattered to him, which was not the arithmetic of money, but the arithmetic of 150 years. And he had decided that the right to sell his ancestors' graves to the highest bidder was a right he was glad to give up. Gladly, forever, in exchange for knowing that no Gaines who came after him would ever be able to be pressured, tricked or forced into selling either. He had taken the temptation off the table for his own grandchildren before they were even born. Zeke Gaines had reached forward across 30 years and taken the option of stealing his land off the table before Garrett Voss had even started shaving. The old farmer, they had all decided, was too simple to understand his own affairs, had decades ago, quietly and completely, made his land untouchable. Zeke straightened up from the table, and he looked out at the silent room, and then he looked at Garrett Voss, whose smooth face had gone the color of paper, and he did not gloat, because that was not in him. He just said quietly, "You came here thinking you were talking to a foolish old man." He shook his head, slow. "My grandmother told me 80 years ago, Let them think you're simple, and they'll show you their whole hand. He gathered his documents back into the shoebox, unhurried. I've known you were coming since before you knew you were coming, son. I've been getting ready for you my whole life. I got ready for you before you were born. He put the lid on the box. That land held my people when they had nothing, and it is going to hold my grandbabies when I am gone. And there is not enough money in your company or jobs in your project to move one single stone on that hill. Now, he picked up his hat. Is there anything else, or can an old man go home and tend his fields? The room did not just go quiet. The room erupted. The farmers and the families who had come to watch the last old man in the county get run off his land, instead, watched him lay a corporation flat with a shoebox. And they came to their feet and they roared for him. And 14-year-old Micah Gaines watched his grandfather, the quiet old man in the overalls, the man he had maybe been a little embarrassed by once or twice the way teenagers are, become, in the space of 10 minutes, the biggest man in the county. The consequences arrived in the order such things do. The commission, faced with an airtight conservation easement and a registered historic cemetery and 150 years of clean title and a room full of their own furious voters, did not just deny the condemnation. They could not have granted it if they had wanted to. The law Zeke had built made it impossible. Garrett Voss's entire development, 3 years and millions of dollars of quietly bought-up farmland, collapsed because it had all depended on getting the parcel in the middle. And the parcel in the middle was a fortress the old man had finished building before Voss ever picked up a phone. And the video, because of course somebody had filmed it, of an 80-year-old farmer opening a shoebox and calmly dismantling a developer in front of his whole county, was watched within a week by millions of people who had never set foot in that state. Because there is something the whole world loves about watching the person everyone underestimated turn out to have been 3 steps ahead the entire time. But Zeke did not care about the video. Zeke went home and tended his fields. He did do one more thing, though, in the years he had left. He had spent his life keeping that burying ground a quiet family secret, a private wall. But after that day, he decided the world should know who was up there under the big oak. So he opened the old cemetery, carefully, respectfully, and he worked with that historian to give the nameless the closest thing to names that history could recover. And he put up a simple marker at the bottom of the rise. It told the story of Isaac Gaines, freed in 1865, landowner in 1868, and of the ones before him with no names, and of a family that held 240 acres of American ground for 150 years and would not be moved. School children come out to the Gaines place now, and they walk up the rise, and they learn that the land under their feet has a story, and that an old man in overalls spent his whole quiet life making sure that story would never be paved over. Micah Gaines is grown now, and the land is his, held in the same trust, clean title, forever farmland, the graves forever protected, exactly the way his grandfather arranged it before he was even born. Micah farms it, and every so often he walks up the rise, to the marker, to the field stones, to Isaac and to Willa, and now to Zeke, who is up there too, and he stands where his grandfather stood. And he understands now what the old man understood, that loving the land was never going to be enough, that you have to be ready, quietly, for the men who will always come, and that the greatest gift one generation can give, the next, is a wall they built so far in advance that the children never even know it kept the storm out. Here is what stays with me about this one. Ezekiel Gaines walked into that room, carrying in a shoebox the total and complete proof that everything the developer said about him was false. And the developer never dreamed it existed, because he had looked at an old black man in overalls and closed the book on the first page. He decided Zeke was simple and slow and finished, and being that sure was the exact thing that beat him. Because a man who is certain you are a fool will never once check to see whether you have been outthinking him for 40 years. The proof was in the shoebox the whole time. Voss just could not imagine that the old farmer had a shoebox worth opening. And that, I think, is the sweetest and most important thing the older folks watching already know, and the younger ones are going to learn. The world will look at your grey hair and your slow hands and your quiet ways, and it will decide that your best days are behind you, that you don't understand how things work anymore, that you can be moved. And every so often, gloriously, the world finds out that the quiet old person it wrote off has been 10 steps ahead the entire time, holding the line, protecting what matters, ready for a day the young fools never even saw coming. Age is not the same thing as weakness. Sometimes it is just a very long time to have gotten ready. In the end, I made Zeke and Isaac up. But I did not invent the theft. Black families really did buy land against impossible odds in the years after slavery, millions of acres of it, and then really did have most of it taken back, farm by farm. Through exactly the quiet legal tricks Zeke spent his life outsmarting, until the land that black families had fought so hard to hold was nearly all gone. That happened. It is one of the great untold robberies of this country. And the Zekes were real too, the careful, quiet, brilliant old farmers who studied the law in their kitchens by lamplight and held on, and held on, and held on, and made sure their grandchildren would still have ground to stand on. Some of you come from that ground. Some of you are still holding it. So let me ask you honestly, what did the quiet old people in your family hold on to and hand down that you only understood the value of much later after they were gone? And if there is an old man or an old woman in your life right now that the world has decided is simple and slow and finished, will you look again and ask them what they know before that shoebox goes into the ground with them? Tell me below about the elder in your family who was 3 steps ahead the whole time. I read every single one. And if this story moved you, share it with someone who was ever underestimated because of their gray hair. And remind them that being old is not the same as being done, and that sometimes the last one standing in the field is the one who was ready all along.